challenge to dignity. Our goal was to link academics, activists, and agencies concerned with the health of refugees and asylum seekers in a spirit of collaboration and comparison, bringing together professionals working with different populations of forcibly displaced peoples, ethnic groups, and nations. The video you are watching will contain all the presentations in one of 5 thematic sessions. We hope you find them to be of value. Welcome back. Our first speaker of the afternoon is Dr. Peter Ventevogel, who is a psychiatrist and medical anthropologist and is the senior mental health expert with UNHCR. He's coming to us from, I believe, from Switzerland. And his topic is, does humanitarian mental health care amount to epistemic violence, or is it a matter of saving lives and addressing social injustice? So to address this question, Dr. Peter Ventevogel.
Okay, I'm now sharing my screen. Is that also the case for you?
We can see it, but it's not on slideshow view. There it goes. Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. And it's sad that I couldn't be with you in person, but well, it actually feels a little bit like I am with you, like having followed the excellent presentations of the colleagues yesterday and today. So I hope it will bring us together somehow. What I want to do is to take you a little bit into my world, which is the world of what I would say humanitarian mental health care. So mental health care in post-conflict settings and emergency situations. I do this work for 20 years now. I'm trained as a psychiatrist, which is a skill that is very helpful in the kind of work that I do. But I'm also trained in social sciences, in medical anthropology, and that's also very helpful. Although sometimes I feel, how did go to say that I feel there are 2 souls dwelling in my breast. It's not so easy to combine the 2 perspectives. And I am passionate about what I do in global mental health, but I also feel we sometimes need to critically reflect on it. And I hope that this meeting creates a safe space to do that. So my first disclaimer then is that you see on the slide that I work with UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, but I don't speak on behalf of them now, which is important because I can speak a bit more free. Not that I think there will be major disagreements, but in the end, I am a civil servant. So this is all on personal title. Well, the first thing I want to say is that within humanitarian mental health, we actually use a broader concept. We talk about MHPSS, a horrible acronym, but it stands for both the more health-oriented interventions, clinical psychology, as well as community-oriented social interventions, mental health and psychosocial support. That is a field that has been growing in humanitarian work over the last decades. And there is good reason for that, because the needs are high and the resources locally are very low. They're either shattered by the emergency itself, or even when they're still there, they're not able to cope, which is the very definition of a humanitarian emergency, a situation where the local resources are insufficient to cope with what happened. And there is a lot of debate and research around how many mental health problems we actually have in a humanitarian setting, and that's an endless debate. But what I usually use are these estimates by the World Health Organization. We can talk a lot about that, about the validity, about how these data were collected. But this is a relatively conservative estimate. So the data are corrected for the way they were collected. So clinical interviews, score higher, and interviews with social functioning included instead of only counting symptoms through a checklist approach also is weighted stronger. If you do that, you can say that in humanitarian settings, around 1 in 5, that's the 22%, has a mental health issue of significance. So what I mean with that is it's so significant that it's difficult for the person or the environment to cope with it by themselves. So you would like to offer some kind of support. And 1 in 20, that's the top row, the 5.1%, have a severe mental health issue, which could be what we usually call severe mental disorders, psychotic disorders, bipolar disorders, but also here severe depression and severe forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's the magnitude. This is significantly higher than what you would find with the same methodology in non-conflict affected populations. I must say this is not about refugees per se. This is about people living in areas that have been affected by major emergencies or forced displacement in the last decade, which is basically the group of people that I work for, but it's a little bit different from refugees in high income settings. What is important here, also you can see that in these prevalence figures already, is that it's not only trauma, but people often assume when I say what I do, they say, so you're working in trauma therapy. And that's not really the only issue. It's also a lot of issues related to pre-existing severe mental disorders and to non-pathological distress or adaptive distress, as Derek Sylov has coined it. And what is important here is that the relation between potentially traumatic events and individual outcomes are mediated to a large extent by daily stress factors. This is a famous research or review article by Ken Miller and Andy Rasmussen that is kind of classic in our field. Now that leads us then to a kind of model that we use based on this very schematic pyramid of multi-layered intervention services. It dates from 2007, when a kind of international committee of experts developed some conceptual clarity in a field that was emerging, but it was also highly polarized with very strong and contrasting views. And the approach here taken was very much a pragmatic consensus-seeking exercise to see, can we agree on what needs to be done? And what you then get is this: you see interventions in different layers of intensity. From the bottom, particularly social interventions integrated, or social considerations, I say it wrong, integrated in basic humanitarian work, which helps alleviating a lot of distress if you do that well, to the layer 2 above that, which is strengthening what social supportive mechanisms there are within communities. And communities are, of course, often shattered in forced displacement settings or in emergencies. There is a reason why we call that the bottom 2 layers, because that's really the foundation of the other things. Sometimes, however, people are not able to solve issues within their own social environment and they need some additional support, and that's the top 2 layers. And then the difference is the level of specialization, with layer 3, focused support provided by people who are not professionals, or at least not specialists. I say it slightly wrong. Now let me go through it a little bit in detail to unpack it. This first layer, the bottom layer. So that's integrating social and psychological considerations in whatever you do. For example, in shelter, you see here 2 slides, 2 photos from the current emergency in East Sudan, where there is a high number of people from Tigray in Ethiopia coming in. And on the left, you see a camp that's obviously constructed by shelter experts. It looks a bit like a Roman camp in the Asterix and Obelix comics that I read in my youth. And it's probably, and the shelter planners are very proud of it because this is like an efficient planning. You can control all factors. And on the right, you see a camp that was established just 2 months before and actually is largely self-settled.
Look at they already built the first house.
Sorry? Can I continue? Hello, can you still hear me?
I'm not sure where that came from.
Oh, okay, so then I continue. So on the right, you see a self-settled camp where you actually see, if you look, I don't know if you can see it, but where you can actually see the tents are placed by the refugees where they thought it was most appropriate, which is families and communities together having tents in kind of concentric forms with an open space in the middle, etc. So this was, in terms of shelter planning, a horrible camp, but in terms of communal well-being, the preferred one. So that's what this layer means, and there are more examples, and this is getting more and more attention. You see some examples about mindful sheltering, about integration of psychosocial aspects in water and sanitation, in education, etc. So that's the layer, the basic layer, layer one. And layer two is about helping people help themselves. You can do that in many ways. One way is by training people in psychological first aid. You see examples here in this slide. But you can also train people within communities to become helpers. And if I have I will show, can you hear it?
ক্যাম্পর মধ্যে হবে তো না আসন হঠাৎ তো না শোন তেমন যদি হইতো না আরে
এটা সে বর্মাত থাকিতাম বর্মাতি 30 অগস্ট 2017 আমাদের আসছি এটা এখন থাকি দিয়ে 2 বছর 4 মাসেই
ওই কমিউনিটি সাইকোসোশ্যাল ভলান্টিয়ার হামগান করতে অনেকেই কি শিখি পাইছো না তুমি কি মনে হয়
আর আছে কমিউনিটি সাইকোসোশ্যাল ভলান্টিয়ারিং গরমमध्ये बहुत কিছু শিখি কি গেনলে আর দিলের আর আমি তন দিল শরীরে দিলে কান ভালো কথা দিয়ে শিখি আর আরতে আছে হনকান অশান্তি হইলে আর কি করি মানে কি হয় না বুঝি আর দিলের আর আমি তো অশান্তি মানে কেঙ্গলি দাগই কেঙ্গলি শান্তি আনাতা আর পরিবার আমাদের অশান্তি কথা আর কি করি আর আছে এই শিখি যে নাকি ধরো আত্মীয় অশান্তি হইলে আই নামাজ দোয়া করি কোরআন শরীফ পড়ি তো এই গান শুনি
Well, this was a big success, I think. Hello? Hello, here I am again. Could you hear anything of what Jamal said? Okay, I see that my connectivity now, and I don't know exactly why that is. What I will do is I will stop the slideshow to make sure that the video has ended. Voila. And now I'll start it again. And perhaps it's better now. Can you hear me better now? I still hear Tom. I think it's Tom from a very far distance, but
Okay.
you can
I
hear me well?
Yeah, if you can hear me now, we were just having a problem with the video. We can hear your spoken voice quite well.
Perfect. So then I'm sorry that the video didn't work, but I wanted to show it to show you how a person who has actually very limited formal education can fulfill a meaningful role within mental health and psychosocial work. And as you can see, this is a person who has learned a lot to help others, but also has learned a lot about how he could cope with distress himself. So that's that layer 2 of strengthening family and community support. I would now like to go to layer 3. That's actually when you want to have an outsider involved. And that's what we call scalable psychological interventions. And those are basically, how I would say, it's psychotherapies or psychotherapeutic techniques, abridged, adapted, and packaged in a way that it can be used by non-specialists and can be done in resource poor settings, at least poor with formal resources. They're mostly based on cognitive behavioral therapy, and they are also mostly manualized, which means that the content is written down in a kind of almost cookbook model where a facilitator can quite easily follow it. There are several examples of it, and I will not go through all of them, but the most fashionable now these days is Problem Management Plus, based on cognitive behavioral therapy. And to unpack it a bit, it's a 5-session model, individual or group, that aims to teach 4 strategies to deal with distress, which is stress management based on slow breathing, problem-solving techniques, making decisions when you feel overwhelmed by many problems and you don't know where to start anymore, behavioral activation, particularly for people who are depressed or so full with negativity that they don't know how to take steps to become active again, and 4, strengthening psychosocial support mechanisms. So finding people in your environment to connect with and then do that in a stepwise approach. So I wanted to highlight this because these actually are very common sense methodologies that you can imagine have high relevance in many different contexts. There are other examples, and the last one about IAT, I'm pretty sure Derek Sylov, who's the father of it, will talk more about it. Then layer 4 is clinical mental health care, and that means actually you work with medically trained people or clinical psychologists and ensure that in every health center, in every health facility, there are some staff available who know what a depression is, what psychosis is, or what even epilepsy is. And the tool that you see here is I've been heavily invested in. I was one of the main consultants in working with it. We've rolled it out, this is the terminology, in UNHCR, and we've done some external evaluations, and we actually have fairly positive results in the sense that we see that people who are trained in a training of a week are better able to identify people with mental health issues and also have a more positive attitude towards people with mental health issues. So for time, this was my elevator pitch. This is what I usually say in a talk when I want to convince people that mental health and psychosocial support is important and that we can do something. I wrote an article or an editorial about it, a little bit triumphalist perhaps, but I believe in it. But I think I have 5 minutes left and I want to spend the 5 minutes to reflect on what I just said. Because
you have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, then I will do it very briefly. So the critique that comes up in me when I think about what I'm doing is, and I'm going back on these layers, I go to layer 4, the top layer. And when you talk about integration of mental health in primary care, the risk is that we essentialize concepts that are actually not so hard as they are taken. And too often, to my horror, I see simplified metaphors of neurotransmitters being used in primary care, and I think it's too simple. It's too simple. And we also have a tendency to silence alternative ways of looking, alternative ways of looking at severe mental health issues in particular. But then again, even when I go that way, I say maybe we are silencing alternative views. Then I always think about this man to the left. It's not him, but it's someone I met in Afghanistan when I worked there 18 years ago. And he was in a traditional healing facility where a kind of Sufi shrine was buried, a sheikh was buried, and he was locked. And we could somehow liberate him and give him a decent mental health treatment that greatly improved his functioning. So there is a bit an element of, are we imposing Western views with all the shortcomings in populations that actually are not waiting for that? Or to what extent are we actually doing more good than harm? And do we really have something to contribute? Now, I think my time is almost done. I wanted to say something about the layer 3, the scalable psychological therapies, and particularly to what extent they are actually framing distress into psychological jargon. And I was very much influenced by the book of Wakefield and Horwitz about the loss of sadness, about how psychiatry transformed normal sorrow into a mental disorder. And you can see that actually happening to some extent in humanitarian settings if you don't take care. There are some ways to do it in a better way. This, for example, community-based social therapy is a scalable psychological intervention that is actually more social than psychological, even though the effects of it on the people who are in these groups is profoundly healing also when it comes to psychological aspects. And then I think I need to stop because I wanted to go to layer 2, the strengthening of family and community support. And what I too often see is that communities are used in a top-down approach. So they are utilized to transmit messages and to bring people to the clinic where the real stuff is happening. What we need to do much more is a bottom-up way of working in which people are empowered to do the things that are really important to them. I'll go to my last slide. I'm sorry that I had so little time for my doubts and reflections, but my question is, how can we navigate through, let's say, respectfully using the body of knowledge that we have gathered in global mental health, which is impressive, but not fall into the trap of imposing ways of looking and thereby silencing alternative modes of seeing. And I think the answer is in these 4 bullets that you see. It's working with community members, use qualitative research to complement the quantitative research, of which there is a lot, listen to community feedback and really listen to it, and have a certain professional humility. There's a lot of talk about cultural humility in practice. I think we also need professional humility in the sense that perhaps a professional is not the one who has the answer. Sorry for taking too much of your time, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. I'd like to start the questioning by referring back to the article you showed about conceptions of mental illness in four African countries. It brings to mind Robert Edgerton's famous article from the 1960s about the conceptions of psychosis in 4 African countries. And we've been dealing since at least then with the issues of cultural meanings of mental illness in relationship to professional psychiatry. And I want to ask you a little bit about that, but even more particularly about your sense of the challenge of indigenous healing for global mental health. Indigenous healing, ritual healing, folk healing, religious healing, whatever term we want to use for it.
Thank you for the question. I did a very close reading of the Edgerton article when I did my research in Africa. And I must say, I quite like what he did, although it is, of course, conceptually quite an old-fashioned approach to ethnography, but it's yeah, there is value in it. The question is, I think, a very, I mean, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, in my view. And what I think is difficult is to what extent traditional healing and ritual healing can help with people who have states of psychosis or mania, for example. There is some evidence, of course, that may work, but I've seen also a lot of the opposite. People being chained, people being abused in traditional healing settings. So I find that a difficult question. It's if you would ask me whether indigenous healing is helpful for people with a depression or with a dissociative disorder, I would absolutely say yes. In many cases, I've seen very good results. When it comes to severe mental disorders, I hesitate, but maybe I should, this needs a longer discussion, obviously, but yeah.
Indeed, thanks. Especially because there's so much variation among different forms of ritual healing. There needs to be renewed effort for detailed ethnographic description at the level of experiential specificity of these different of the nature of therapeutic process in these different forms of healing. Let's turn to Catherine.
Hi, Peter. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Nice to see you. Nice. So you basically make a point about how we understand a body of knowledge without imposing changing practices of care without imposing a mindset at the same time to do so. So engaging with communities collaboratively when you're trying to change the practice of care. But I was very struck when you started the video of Jamal, who was interviewed by, I think it's in Nepali, possibly, by this woman who is, or Nepali similar.
It's in Bangladesh, but it's, yes, it's close. Similar language.
Yeah. So the Bangladeshi woman, who I suppose is a community worker, switches into English with 2 words when she says the word community and when she says the word psychosocial. So so it's an incredibly interesting example on how 2 people are talking about the benefits of psychosocial care, but switch to English to explain the concept of community and the concept of psychosocial. Now, I'm not particularly anxious about it because we need to innovate on concepts, and we have this, bricolage. We take one word from one language and put it in another, but it's striking that she uses those 2 English words. Do you want to tell me, I'm not surprised about the word psychosocial because I think that's a really difficult one to find in the local language, but it did strike me that it was about the word community, because that would be an easy local equivalent. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can't give you the full answer because I hadn't noticed it in this video, I must be honest. But there is an issue also with the language because the refugee speaks Rohingya language and the interviewer speaks Bengali, but not of the Chittagonian variant, which is more similar to the Rohingya language. So there are issues with language here, even though they seem to have a conversant dialogue with a similar language, but actually there are differences. And we have tried to assist here by, for example, making vocabularies and having a review based on ethnographic research on local concepts. But the translatability of some key terms of the work that we do is limited.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit worrying if even a word like community or family would not be translatable, because that can't be true. That just cannot be true. So I don't know what's going on here. Yeah, but your point is well taken.
Thank you very much, Peter. Our next speaker is Professor Derek Sylov, who's emeritus professor at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. He's worked with refugees, asylum seekers, and other socially disadvantaged communities for over 40 years in research, clinical work, training, and development. His topic is adapting to mass trauma and displacement, testing and implementing the ADAPT model.
Yes, good morning on my side anyway, and good afternoon on yours. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
And see me? Because I'm not sure I can see you. But in any event, I'll get started. And greetings from Australia. And I'm really very pleased to be with you all. Apparently you cannot see me, is that correct?
I think you're coming.
Do you want to turn on your video, Dr. Sylov?
I'm trying to, and nothing's happening. I'm not sure.
The bottom left, did you take it off? Did you put it on video, the bottom left?
Have you seen me at all? I'm trying to.
If you go to the start video icon at the bottom left, that should do it.
Yeah.
I have clicked on it, but it says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
Oh.
Okay, so that's the ticket.
Yes, okay. Can we wait for the co-host on your computer? Okay.
You'll have it worked out in a flash, Derek.
Okay, no, that's okay. Shall I get going anyway, or?
No, give us 1 second. We're making you host so that you could turn on your video. Sorry, apologies.
Okay, no, that's.
It says make host. You didn't see it. Go back. I saw make host. Alexis.
I got it. No worries.
It says make host.
Dr. Sylov, are you still there?
There he is, right there at that icon right there. He was there.
Oh.
There he is, right? Yep.
We're almost there. I'm gonna make you a co-host. Yes, all right. So, Dr. Sylov, will you please try again to share your video? Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
I can see you. The room can see you. Thank you so much for for your patience.
It must be the distance over the Pacific or something. Yeah. Anyway, I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very grateful to Thomas for inviting me. And it's wonderful to hear that our Institute of Global Health is taking this area of work so seriously. Not many are, and I really congratulate you on that. And I'm also pleased to hear that Peter was preceded me, because a lot of the work we have done recently has been with Peter, and it couldn't have gone ahead without him. So I'd just like to acknowledge his enormous help over recent times. So what I'd like to do is just rush through, in the short time we have, the background experience we've had with asylum seekers in Australia, and also then introduce you to the ADAPT model and give you some brief outline of the model, as well as the new therapy that we've developed in relation to that model. So if I could have the next slide, please. I mean, I think you probably covered this in your discussions to date, but when we first started in the field, when I first started in the 1980s, we sort of inherited the trauma arrow PTSD model from psychiatric traumatology, and very soon realized that it was inadequate for the field that we're in. That's not to say it's not relevant, and it's a very long discussion about that. I don't reject the notion of trauma or PTSD, in fact, at all, but it's only one small component of the work we do, as we well know, that we do have to consider a whole range of other issues with asylum seekers and refugees, including all of those listed on the screen. And I covered that originally in my article many years ago in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, which was really the initiating thoughts that led to the ADAPT model in the first place. Next slide, please. I mean, for myself, working in the field in Australia, just to give you a very quick bit of history, I was shocked to find asylum seekers being held in detention. And, you know, this was after working with government for a long time in the refugee area. And that, you know, when Australia was quite benevolent and helped set up centres around the country, and we were working hand in glove with government at the time. And then suddenly this spectre arose of asylum seekers being held in detention. So I had this weird experience of working in a well-established torture and trauma service, treating refugees. And then 10 minutes down the road, I would go to the detention centre and find their compatriots with exactly the same histories, held in prison-like conditions for no reason other than the way they had entered the country, which according to the government was unauthorised. Of course, we know that refugees have a right to seek asylum, and I've never understood the notion that it's illegal to do so. So I suddenly caught, and many of my colleagues with me, in this bizarre situation of treating two identical populations under extremely different conditions, one very welcoming and the other harsh and deterrent. Asylum seekers in the community were living under severe restrictions in relation to work, income, English language classes, training, and so on. They were being subjected to testing and stressful determination procedures. They were placed under prohibitions in terms of family reunion or right to leave country if their family were ill or in desperate need. And some of them were, for rather arbitrary reasons, held in detention, often for prolonged periods of time under prison-like conditions, including then in remote areas of our country, which, as you know, is huge, And so in the middle of the desert, there would be a detention center holding asylum seekers. And increasingly, we discovered that children were being held in these facilities. Now, all of that is familiar to you now because we were the kind of the forerunner of this policy, sadly, in our country. And I covered that early history with Charles Waters, actually, who I see is also at the conference in that paper that I've listed at the bottom. Next slide, please. So that's just one of the many awful pictures of a child in detention in our country. Next slide, please. So we decided, because the government kept insisting that there was no systematic evidence that holding people in detention or under restrictive conditions in the community was impacting negatively on their mental health. This was a constant refrain that we were exposed to. We started to undertake the first research in this country and in some senses in the world on the specific mental health of asylum seekers, and especially focusing on their post-migration living difficulties, which was in a sense an expansion of the existing trauma model, which tended to refer back to human rights violations in the country of origin in relation to the causation of their mental health problems. So this was a study just looking at all the factors that impacted on anxiety and depression, PTSD in particular. And while the number of trauma experiences in the home country was significant, so were all these other post-migration stresses and deprivations, which again, you're quite familiar with. But this was just one of the early studies showing systematically that this in fact was the case. Next slide, please. We also followed up a group of asylum seekers under temporary protection, it was called in Australia TPVs, and looked at the longer term effects of living under these conditions. Next slide, please. And this just shows the difference between those on permanent residency and those on temporary protection. The temporary protection visa holders are in pink. And just to rush through these slides quickly, you'll see that there's a huge difference, of course, between the two in all respects. But overall, there was an increase in problems in asylum seekers over time, whereas permanent residents had a decrease in problems over time, as you would expect. PTSD was so high in the asylum seekers that it remained static, in that it had reached the ceiling effect, if you like, whereas anxiety increased, depression increased, general health symptoms increased in comparison to their compatriots from much the same countries who were granted permanent residency. Next slide, please. Similarly, when we looked at more general issues of worry about residency status, living difficulties as a whole, social coping and English proficiency, you can see again, always in the negative for those on temporary protection over a 2-year period. Next slide, please. We tried for many years to get permission to interview asylum seekers in detention, especially again because of this claim that there was no evidence that it was doing any mental health harm. This was denied us repeatedly by government or just evaded. The requests were just left to line tables of bureaucrats and so on. Initially, we were able to view a family in a detentions in Australia. And this is just a group of people whom I work with who took a strong lead in this research. Next slide, please. And these essentially were the findings. We interviewed 10 families by phone. Interestingly, they were allowed to phone us and we were allowed to phone them. So these were 14 adults and 20 children. all the adults and all the children met diagnostic criteria for at least one psychiatric disorder, and many of them met criteria for multiple psychiatric disorders. And if you compared that with their histories, there was a multifold increase in mental disorder and problems since being in detention. And most strikingly, the detainees described exposure to multiple forms of trauma within the detention center itself. And that's listed below, all the awful experiences they were exposed to while in detention. And some of these violent protests and so on, gained public attention and caused great controversy in our country at the time. Next slide, please. So really, I guess we were all trying to work out, and I was especially preoccupied with, what kind of overarching psychosocial stroke mental health model would accommodate our observations amongst these people who were exposed to such complex forms of human rights violations, trauma, and deprivations. And that's helped me, in a sense, to develop what I've subsequently called the ADAPT model. Next slide, please. So that stands for Adaptation and Development After Persecution and Trauma. And essentially, I, through a process of experience and interaction with colleagues and, of course, with our beneficiaries, I sort of felt that we could organize our very complex thinking under 5 psychosocial pillars, which are really, in a sense, the foundations that we all depend on in our society, within our institutions, and the way society is organized to provide us with the foundations for sound mental health. And that is the issues of safety and security, attachment, bonding and networks, justice, identity roles, and the capacity to live a life which has coherence and meaning. And all those arrows just point to the final pathways that can eventuate in people where these pillars of society, these institutions of society are grossly undermined. That's not to indicate that it's a kind of deterministic, simple relationship. There are many steps between the undermining of safety and security and the expression of PTSD and anxiety and so on. And there are many areas of potential resiliency and adaptation that can take place to actually avoid those outcomes. So this is a simplistic model, and it doesn't show the intervening steps that either strengthen or weaken people's resiliency to these adverse outcomes. Next slide, please. So this is just another depiction of the model. Those are the pillars in the middle, and these pillars obviously relate to a number of and derive from a number of disciplines and systems of thinking: human rights, clinical traumatology, community recovery and development, amongst many others, of course. Next slide, please. Just to underline some of the principles that underpin the ADAPT model. There are many, but these are some of them that are relevant to asylum seekers. That is, for asylum seekers, the key psychosocial pillars and foundations of society that in normal circumstances support health and psychosocial well-being are simultaneously eroded. This undermining of social systems occurs throughout the course of the asylum process, which is a continuous process of persecution, flight, dangerous journeys, temporary asylum, and arrival in countries of asylum. The undermining of those psychosocial systems exacerbates effects of past human rights violations and ongoing stresses. So there's this complex compounding effect, which of course is not easy to capture using ordinary research methods because of this complex compounding effect. And I think of interest is that the intrapsychic and behavioral responses that we often see in asylum seekers mirror and interact with the eroded external psychosocial systems. So they actually make sense. They're not bizarre that someone who experiences constant affront to their dignity, to their sense of justice, develop problems with managing anger. People have loss and bond disruption, end up with grief reactions of various types and so on. So the reactions themselves are not just some diagnosis in a classification system, but really make sense in terms of their experiences. Now, next slide, please. So if we can just stop there. So if we just ignore the ADAPT side of it, the model that you've got on your screen is essentially the standard PTSD model that many traumatologists have worked with for years, which is pre-existing trauma, ongoing adversity leads to PTSD and results in functional impairment. And in a sense, the ADAPT model then extends that. You can just continue with that slide, please. If we could just tap on the rest of that, please. Just keep going. So this is the expanded model, and it's actually based. What I'm showing is based on an empirical study of a group of asylum seekers to show that, in fact, the ADAPT pillars interact with and compound the existing trauma model. That's the only message I want to get across because it's too complex to go through the model in detail. But the broken lines are the indirect effects and the continuous lines are direct effects. But it just shows that at all levels, the ADAPT pillars interact with and compound the standard trauma model. Next slide, please.
2 minutes left, Eric.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
2 minutes left.
Okay, so I'll go through this very quickly. This has led us to developing the integrated ADAPT therapy program, and I must acknowledge Alvin Tay, who's my colleague who's been very active in this. We essentially have developed a brief psychotherapy, which Peter van der Vogel has helped greatly in testing based on the ADAPT model. Next slide, please. It's a very complex set of procedures, which is sort of outlined in step form here, and which I won't have time to go into, but just to show that there are many steps in the process, but heavily focused on the ADAPT model. Next slide, please. We use a whole lot of different simple methodologies to assist participants understand and interact with the ADAPT model. Next slide, please. And then next slide again. And there's been extensive background work as listed here in the development of the program, and work especially with Myanmar refugees, the Rohingya, Chin and Kachin. And we've been through a lot of cultural adaptation and ethnographic work in preparation and a lot of piloting. Next slide, please. These are some of the effect sizes in a RCT that we've completed and published, just to show you the impact of IAT on a range of outcomes, including all the standard psychiatric diagnoses, as you can see, PTSD, depression, and so on, but also on measures of the ADAPT pillars themselves, which is included in the category of the ASI, which actually measures change in the perception and the impact of those experiences. And you'll see that secondary outcomes were also good, generalized anxiety disorder and grief. And overall, the trend was for greater improvement with IAT in the immediate aftermath of treatment compared to just a standard CBT treatment, although the differences were slight, noting that that both treatments were effective. Next slide, please. Okay, this is really the final slide. Just to say that again, with Peter's help at Cox's Bazar, which I have never visited, I should admit, and the work has really been done with Peter and again, Alvin Tay, my colleague, and others on the ground, obviously community workers and agencies at Cox's Bazar. But this was more an implementation outcome study for group IAT, and the preliminary findings are showing rather large effect sizes for all outcomes. And this is in the midst of a rather unstable emergency situation, as you know, in a fairly chaotic environment. So it's interesting that the therapy was still helpful to people within that situation. Okay, I know my time has run out, so I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Thank you. We have questions? Any questions from here in the room?
Quick question.
Teresa, yes.
Yeah. Derek, thanks for an amazing talk and all that you're doing on these topics. I'm excited to see you working with the Rohingya too, and I'm going to put you in touch with some people. I wanted to ask your thoughts on what you think the mechanisms are by which being in detention relates to greater mental distress. Is it actually detention, or is it the uncertainty and the insecurity? So I'm thinking of the Remain in Mexico policy in Title 42 in this country, where asylum seekers, have to remain in this very insecure environment in Mexico. And I wonder about the ways in which that is a form of detention that's just as damaging for mental health, and what your thoughts are on, is it detention per se, or is it insecurity and uncertainty? Because when you're in a facility, technically you're safe, but you don't know where you're going. You're in this interstitial space for a long time. The Remain in Mexico policy in ways could be even more damaging. So I would just love your thoughts on that. What are the mechanisms here?
Yeah, look, that's a fantastic question, and it's worthy of further research, and I'd encourage you to do that because, we measured all the detention related factors in one of our several studies, especially people who'd left detention, and they obviously the scores on those measures were very high, so it was a bit hard to tease out which of those stressors made the difference, because they were also highly correlated, really. But I think, as you say, conceptually, there are three things at least, if not more. The one is simply being held in detention and the uncertainties about the future that go along with it, and just the pure issue of being confined, especially amongst people who've been confined previously. The second is conditions in the detention centre, which in Australia have been pretty harsh and terrifying for many people, which has included, the treatment they received, deprivations that they've experienced, and also the disruptions that have occurred through protests and people publicly committing suicide, for example, or harming themselves as a form of protest and so on. But the third, which I think is really critical and has come out more or less consistently over time, is the length of detention. And I'd refer you to a paper which is in the Medical Journal of Australia by an inmate who was a doctor himself from Iraq. And I just don't have it at my fingertips. But he described from the inside, the series of changes that he noted in himself and in others as time passed while in detention. And that's really worth reading. And I'll provide you with a reference if you would like, because it shows how the time, over time, how people lose hope And in the end, some of them become virtually catatonic as all hope dissipates. I mean, we've had people in detention for up to 7 years, including children, actually, and adolescents. And many have ended up on a hunger strike and so on because they've been so desperate. And it's, I have to say, no fun managing people on hunger strike, especially young people, which has been my experience. Anyway, that's a long-handed account of what I'm saying, but I think it's worthy. Your question's very worthy, and it's really important if we accept that detention is going to happen and there's nothing much we can do about it. We need to at least think of ways to try to improve conditions, and research in that area to tease these things out are really would be really important.
Thank you. Please do send that reference when you find it.
I will, yes.
Thank you very much, Derek. We appreciate your intervention. Our
That's
next
fine.
speaker is Dr. Bridget Haas, who is visiting assistant professor of anthropology at Case Western Reserve University. Her work explores the emotional, psychological, and social effects of immigration policies on asylum applicants in the United States. We're pleased to have Dr. Haas with us. Bridget, it's all yours.
Okay. I'm hoping everyone can see and hear me.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So thank you so much to Tom for this generous invitation to present at this conference. It has been such a really dynamic and stimulating day and a half, with I know still more to come. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this important larger conversation on migrant health and well-being. Thanks to Alexis and the rest of the UCSD crew for getting this conference up and running. I know, particularly with this hybrid model, that is a no small feat. I just want to make one note. In the abstract, I had suggested that I would be drawing on both my past and ongoing research with asylum seekers in the US, as well as newer research with a refugee community that I'm working with. And both in the interest of time and because my current research has been really delayed in fits and starts because of COVID over the last year and a half. I'm going to concentrate primarily on my asylum seeker research, but speaking to the domains that are in the abstract. And I'm happy to talk about that other research in the Q&A if that's helpful. So before delving into a more focused discussion on ambiguous loss and protracted family separation in the context of asylum seeking, I want to first provide some context regarding my broader approach and thinking in terms of migration and health. And so in the broadest sense, my ethnographic research has been focused on the bureaucratic violence of immigration regimes, particularly in the US asylum system, and its everyday lived and embodied consequences among migrants embedded in these systems. And overall, my aim has really been to contribute and advance theorizing on migration and well-being in two specific ways. First, to see the pain and distress, including poor mental and physical health of refugees and asylum seekers, not necessarily as inherent to the process of displacement or forced mobility, but rather as produced and or exacerbated through specific state policies and procedures related to migration and border control. And second, my work really seeks to expose what I think of as the slow violence of immigration systems and bureaucracies, that is, the forms of institutional or bureaucratic violence that are often normalized and often hidden, but nonetheless powerful in shaping refugee and asylum seeker well-being. And so I have up a continuum of violences here that I'll address in just a second, but this focus on slow violence, I think, takes us away from the more spectacular forms of violence that panelists in this conference have so richly and importantly addressed. So my interlocutors were asylum seekers, so those who had formally lodged an asylum claim with the US government. And they were claims that were not issued at a port of entry or after being apprehended by DHS, which would be considered a defense of asylum claims, but rather entered into an affirmative process whereby they were claiming asylum in a non-border or interior location. And I've done most of my work with asylum seeking in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area. So my interlocutors and my friends, my asylum seeker friends, were not routinely, or at least not initially, subjected to the egregious and overt forms of violence against asylum seekers that other panelists have addressed, things like immediate detention, the MPP program, or expedited removal. And though not to suggest an equivalency, I think it's critical that, as William Lopez has argued, attention to the hyperviolence of the state expressed through technologies like deportation and detention not render invisible other forms and experiences of violence and their impact on migrants' lives and bodies. And indeed, I would argue that these different forms of violence and this range of technologies of power, from the overt and physical to the hidden and bureaucratized, are all undergirded by the same ideologies and politics of racialized exclusion, xenophobia, and criminality. And so on the slide here, I've just enumerated some of these forms of violence, which elsewhere I've discussed in much greater length. And each of these bullet points could warrant an entire conversation or entire presentation itself. And so I'm giving them here primarily as background for you to understand what I'm considering or talking about in terms of these bureaucratic violences associated with the asylum process. And so this includes things like a bureaucratic opacity, a lack of access to information, what Thomas Ordonez has called a state of confusion, what I think of as an institutional manufacturing or governing through confusion, and social, structural, or economic precarity. So this includes delays in work authorization, lack of access to housing, material, or cash assistance. And I would note here that the United States is one of the only industrialized host countries identified by the UN that denies access for asylum claimants both to immediate access to work and any form of governmental support. And then finally, the third bullet point here just talks about the interpretive or epistemic violence of the adjudication or legal proceedings. And I'm not going to go into these any further, but I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A, but I am going to relate them to this issue of protracted family separation. And then finally, importantly, I think perhaps the most salient of all of the technologies of power associated with the asylum seeking process is the idea of temporal governance, where waiting is both a technique of power and an embodied phenomenon, a lived phenomenon. And this image here comes from a legal scholar and advocate, Jason Zubo, that talks, encapsulates this excruciating wait that people, and so my interlocutors waited for years and years for the adjudication of their claims. And it was exactly this kind of uncertainty and waiting that people described in terms of trauma. And these are direct quotes from my interlocutors as a kind of trauma, a psychological game, or a form of torture. And I put this up not to go through all the boxes. This is a flow chart of the various steps and possibilities for an asylum procedures. And but I give it here as a visual just to point to the ways in which this is A, very complex, and B, that at each level of these steps requires another kind of protracted waiting. And so again, we're talking kind of years for this to happen. First and foremost, I'm sorry, I think I missed a slide. Nope. So before I go further, I just want to talk about in this question, in this continuum of violence, to note that these aren't discrete and that these are actually very interrelated. And to this point, I just wanted to bring up just one example. For example, in August of 2020, a final issue ruled by the Trump administration went into effect, requiring asylum seekers to wait an entire 365 days after filing their asylum application before they're eligible for employment authorization. And this is a shift that from 1996 to up until this date was 180 days, still a long time. And this was often longer for various bureaucratic reasons. But this puts asylum seekers, as I show, and their families in increasingly precarious positions as they await the adjudication of their claims. And yet, this seems to be exactly the point. So buried within the DHS final ruling, specifying these changes to wait times, The DHS, and this is their language, suggested that asylum seekers, quote, become familiar with homelessness resources provided by the state and where they intend to reside. And so here we have a stark example of how temporal governance acts as a mechanism to produce precarity. So within this overarching bureaucratic violence in mind, I want to focus more specifically on how the immigration regime's state and institutional power come to be transnationally shared and embodied, its effects stretching beyond the bodies of asylum claimants themselves to those of loved ones across the globe. And so how do these violences come to be transnationally embodied? And first and foremost, I want to emphasize that my interlocutors framed asylum and the quest for asylum, not just or even primarily about personal existential security, although all felt that their lives were in danger of their countries of citizenship. But they framed this primarily as a relational and a familial act. And although asylum is adjudicated on an individual basis, and with very few exceptions, most of my interlocutors came alone, leaving family behind. So again and again, people told me, I'm doing this for my family, or this is for my children. And in this way, asylum was not just an act of survival, but an act of moral striving. It was a way of envisioning a good life, and a good life here being one that not only keeps them alive, but also affords them a way to envision a viable future for themselves and their families. And I think Charles Waters' presentation yesterday really spoke to these kind of aspirational qualities about and ways that kind of muddy this distinction between just flight out of fear versus aspiration. And so this idea of ambiguous loss I have drawn on because I think it's instructive to the study of asylum in a couple of different ways. So this idea of ambiguous loss comes from psychologist Pauline Boss, who was not speaking about migration. And this has been applied to various contexts. But ambiguous loss as a relational disorder in which a loved one is either physically present but psychologically absent, or psychologically present but physically absent. And this has applied and been applied to asylum, to the study of migration in a couple of different and important ways, I think, from my discussion. First is that, as Outrejean and Northwood have described, asylum itself is a form of ambiguous loss, both because it forces individuals to exist within a paradox of absence and presence. So ultimately, the asylum process is marked by this all-encompassing absence of information regarding one's national identity, future safety, loss of a defined country, culture, place of resettlement, while waiting for the outcome of their asylum cases. And then second, that protracted involuntary family separation as a kind of ambiguous loss, and ambiguous because there's uncertainty about whether the separation represents an irreversible loss. And we'll see how this looks in my research setting. So one way in which these bureaucratic violences come to be transnationally embodied is the effect of protracted family separation as an effect of transnational governance. And I titled this slide an effect of temporal governance, but I think it may actually be more aptly described as family separation as a form or a technology of governance itself. And of course, here and throughout, I'm talking about something different than the family separations that we're seeing at the border. This is something, again, in line with these hidden and bureaucratized forms of family separation. So particularly given the ways in which asylum seeking was understood as a relational familial act, enduring family separation was one of the most salient sources of pain and distress for my interlocutors. So Sarah, who's an asylum seeker from Zimbabwe, described it this way: this asylum process is taking too long. I can't keep waiting. Maybe I can keep waiting, but without my kids, I don't know. I think if immigration would just let me bring my family, at least I've had a peace of mind. You know, I would just feel like a human again. And this utterance has stayed with me. And I recall this exchange, one of so many that I had with Sarah, over and over again. And what was immediately and pretty exquisitely striking about Sarah's words was the equation of her very humanity with the presence of her children. Her words were not unique here. And asylum claimants expressed their intense grief and excruciating longing for family that they had left behind in their countries of origin, drawing deep connection between a life worth living and the presence of family. And this was certainly one of the most salient aspects of pain and distress for my asylum seekers. And in suggesting that reunification with her children could restore her humanity, Sarah subtly but critically indicts the US immigration system in part for her separation. Though she acknowledges that she bore responsibility for leaving her children, a sacrifice that she did to save her life, and in doing so, save her children from losing a mother, Sarah rightfully locates the protraction of separation as an effect of the asylum system. Thus, it was not just the fact of family separation that was so difficult for asylum claimants, but also the uncertainty and opacity surrounding its timeline. Because asylum seekers were uncertain about the duration of the separation from family, they suffered a loss that was ambiguous, a loss that they could not fully or concretely mourn, nor whose reversal in the form of reunification they could hopefully anticipate. And also implicit in Sarah's linkage between her humanity and her children's presence is a promise of family reunification that asylum seekers saw as inherent to the asylum status. Because asylum seekers, I knew, experienced their sense of self as inseparable from the cherished loved ones, that their spouses and their children were essential to their ability to flourish, they held fast to the promise, which was often, as I'll see in a bit, illusory, but they held fast to the promise that asylum status, though individually granted, would have shared effects. So precisely because waiting and was transnationally embodied and intersubjectively felt, for asylum seekers, family relationships and communication could at turns be supportive and caring and emotionally painful and distressing. And here I have a longer quote from Hassan, an asylum seeker who had been waiting many, many years for a resolution of his asylum claim. He's talking about discussing with his family members. They asked me, when are we going to see you? And that's the hardest thing. They always grill me when I call them. When are you coming? When are you coming? When are you coming? When are you coming? And I have to keep telling them, wait, just keep waiting. But I've been telling them that for 5 years. They don't understand. I mean, they don't know the whole process, the procedure. It's very hard not to see them. I think I cry when I see their pictures. I cry thinking, when will I see them again? Or even will I, or what's going to happen? And my mother, she knows that she's going to die. She doesn't have many years left. She's a 3-time cancer survivor. And she told me, I'm afraid I'll die before I see you again. I don't want to die before. I don't want to close my eyes until I see you. So Hassan, because asylum claimants are unable to travel outside the United States, lest their claims be rendered ineligible, Hassan was uncertain as to when and even if he would be able to see his mother again before she died. The sting of that reality was exacerbated by his family's understandable but nonetheless difficult grilling and Hassan's perceived inability to fully articulate the complexity of the asylum procedures to him. Thus, phone and video calls with loved ones could be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, asylum claimants were able to maintain an important connection to family members. Phone calls were also a medium in which asylum claimants could parent from afar and perform meaningful care. But on the other hand, talking to family members could generate painful feelings of longing, guilt, and anxiety, as well as exposing interfamilial tensions evoked by a protracted and bewildering asylum process. So another way that these bureaucratic violences could be transnationally embodied and felt was the way in which waiting and transnationally shared waiting could increase risk and could serve as a risk. So the cruel irony here is that while the liminal period of asylum seeking meant that asylum seekers had a temporary and tenuous form of protection, this same protracted liminality could mean that family members back home were at increased risk. And I'll give just one example from my fieldwork before getting to this quote. But one afternoon deep in my fieldwork, I was knocking on the door of Ruth's apartments. My knocks became quickly louder when she didn't answer the door after several minutes. I was worried. She had not answered her phone or returned her message in a couple of days. I had taken to talking to Ruth nearly every day and seeing her many times throughout the week. So I breathed a sigh of relief when I heard her unlocking the door. Her hair, usually covered neatly with a wig, was unkempt and she wore a nightgown and a robe, her face sweaty. "Oh, Bree," she said, using the nickname she adopted for me, "I'm not well. My whole body's not well." And she let me into her apartment. She explained that her son in Cameroon was arrested by the gendarmes, the military police, and they beat him, they threatened him. I don't know what to do, she told me. This happened because when her 15-year-old son walked to school one day and he was apprehended by police who had come, as they had been for years, looking for Ruth. She said, what am I to do? My whole family is in danger and I'm here not knowing if I'm staying or going. And I'm waiting and waiting and languishing for so many years, but I'm their mother and I'm still here, but I'm still their mother. I can't go back to Cameroon, I know that, but I want to bring my children here so they can be safe. This is the whole reason I'm here. I'm doing this for them. And likewise, this quote comes from Emmanuel, another Cameroonian asylum seeker, who tells me, when my wife calls crying and crying, it's like hell. It's like passing through hell because they're now troubling her. And I feel like, oh my God, why should things still be continuing like this? I'm finally away from them. Why should they still be following my family? And I would just note too that there's empirical and kind of quantitative evidence to show that these things do exist and that there actually is risk to not only family members at home, but for asylum seekers who are then deported. And finally,
1 minute left.
Oh my goodness, seriously. Okay, so maybe I'll talk about this last slide and then I'll go on. So the shared effects of structural and economic precarity. So again, this is particularly painful with regard to the weights on work authorization times. So for example, I want to give this quote from Ahmed, who had over years and years been still having trouble getting his work authorization. He said, I want to work. If I was allowed to a job, I would work any job, but I have no document. So the cruel thing is, how can I survive? And now my family's also suffering so badly. I lost my father. According to my religion, my culture, my people, I should replace my father and take care of my family. How should I provide for them? I should provide for them, but I can't help myself. So how can I help them? And I would say, and so Ahmed felt not only the financial struggle caused by the delay of a work permit, but also the emotional burden pained by his inability to fulfill this gendered and cultural role as family provider. If obligations and commitments to others are, as Bourdieu has argued, continuous justification for existing, then asylum seekers' inability to meet the expectations of their loved ones was demoralizing and deeply distressing. That is, rather than become reasons for their existence in the context of asylum seeking, familial expectations, pleas and solicitations of support, expressions of pain and desperation often contributed to asylum seekers' sense of suffering. Just as the fraught family relations between Louise and Hassan noted earlier, these cultural and familial expectations that Ahmed describes here, but is ultimately unable to fulfill, function as Ackerman and Panter-Brick have so beautifully described, quote, both as an anchor for resilience and an anvil of pain. And am I out of time?
You can make a concluding comment if you like.
Okay, so the slides, I don't know, I must have been so off on my timing, but I had some slides and I maybe can field these questions if people are interested on the ways in which, even after granted asylum, there's a kind of new and protracted system where people are waiting and waiting. And then sometimes during these times, I have several examples where even if family paperwork, so people are waiting, the wait time sometimes for adult children is 102 months currently. And so as people are kind of languishing in this new forms of waiting and new forms of bureaucratic violence, so for some people, family members have died and they've not been able to mourn them. So kind of new invocations of ambiguous loss. And so I think ultimately this work then suggests that we think critically about the ways in which these structural violence and the bureaucratic violences of the immigration system often work to, in very silent ways, foreclose the possibility of refuge, even for people who are granted legal status. Thank you.
So we have about 5 minutes left for questions. Olga, yes.
Thank you for your presentation, very interesting. And I'm wondering, since we are looking at the cases in the Mexican side that they are waiting then, but after they start or continue the process in the US, I'm wondering if the pandemic or any current situation, is it affecting this asylum process that they are following in the US after crossing the border? Is something changed, the length of time or the procedures, something that had to do with this recent changes?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, so even before, as many panelists have discussed already, I mean, even before COVID, there had been so many changes to the asylum regime by the Trump administration. And so certainly we saw those visible on the actual border, but even within the asylum adjudication process itself. And so I think it was Kristen who mentioned the backlog of 1.5 million cases, and not all of these, but many of these are asylum cases as well. So the Trump administration also implemented a new policy called last in, first out, where so people later in the queue would just have to keep waiting longer and longer. And so it's, I think, not unheard of that people now are getting their asylum cases, even just to get a merits hearing, 4 or 5 years out. And then COVID, of course, just extended this even further. So, so it's been kind of a growing and more entrenched problem for this, and it's combined with an increasing of denial rates as well. And so this kind of is seemingly kind of an intractable situation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, Bridget, you've dealt explicitly with the idea of waiting. And Olga's paper, which comes right after the break, will also deal explicitly with that. So we're in a conjunction of different forms and modes of waiting here. Catherine?
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. House. It's a very moving presentation. And in this conference, we've been going back and forth with some of the presentation that you make, which show that it's really an inhumane system that puts people in the forks of danger and harm, but also presentations that show that there is collective action and solidarity and agency. So my question is, I don't want to gloss over the inhumane system, but I'm also asking what is the civil society action that can actually change. So, I mean, I can't think that, explaining to the bureaucratic system that they are making suffering worse actually is even worth trying to do. But what are the local systems that help provide support and system? Are they weak? Are they very patchy? Are they very ineffective? Are they effective? I mean, I'm just trying to see the other side of your story, not to minimize what you just explained, but also to kind of try and move past it or forward with it.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine, for that comment. And so absolutely. And so, and in my broader framing of, so here I'm specifically focusing on the bureaucratic violences, but in the larger framing, particularly with my interlocutors, I think what partly makes asylum so painful is that people, sorry, I was just reading from Seth Hanna's comment that probably not helpful to call out the cruelty when cruelty is often the point. But this is a generative space as well, right? And so I have many examples that elsewhere I talk about where people are actually kind of using asylum as a kind of generative of hope and new forms of belonging. And so there is this different side of it as well with asylum. But specific to the asylum process, I think that as far as collective action, I think that part of the collective action, I think, is difficult in terms of affecting change on these kind of smaller kind of bureaucratic changes. It's kind of hard to mobilize around these, kind of decreasing backlog times or things like that if you're talking about those kind of more routinized bureaucratic violences. But I think that there are points, for example, where things can be improved in terms of just improving the kind of recognition of the dignity of people going through this process. So, for example, and speaking out against those or refusing, and I have examples of asylum seekers refusing, to kind of enduring this process and refusing to be fully interpolated as this kind of criminal other, right? But, like these kind of routinized bureaucratic violences, like people's asylum cases, just they're getting canceled abruptly and moved to the back of the queue because the immigration judge was sick that day, right? And they have to wait another 10 days for it. And so I think, particularly with legal advocates, I think speaking out against these kind of issues, I think is helpful, but it's difficult because so many of these things are a kind of invisible violences, and they're so routinized as part of the process. And another paper that I recently published in Cultural Medicine and Psychiatry, I talk about the sometimes stickiness of trying, for example, to teach people to abide time in a way that kind of just makes their waiting more palatable rather than as a political problem. So I think I'm kind of going in different directions, but I really take your point that that's not the whole picture. And I think, part of my work is to try to situate myself in a critical refugee study, so I'm not kind of fetishizing suffering for the sake of suffering or not focusing on a damage-centered approach. But I do think my intervention is by exposing these kind of violences or these routinized processes as forms of violence. I'm hoping that there might be an opening for change. So I don't have a clear answer to that, but I appreciate your question, and it's something I think about too.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Our next paper is jointly authored by Olga Ogers, who is a sociologist whose principal research interests are in the crossroads of migration, religion, and health, focusing on the experience of migrants trapped in mobility on the US-Mexico border. She is a professor at El Colegio de la Frontera Norte in Tijuana. And Olga Olivas Hernandez, who is an anthropologist with research expertise on new spiritualities, mental health, and migration, as well as substance abuse and healing systems. She is also in the social studies department at El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, and she is also a lecturer in the global health program here at UC San Diego. The title of the talk is The Use of Waiting as a Deterrent to Migration and Its Effect on the Well-Being of Asylum Seekers. Olga?
Thank you so much for this introduction and for organizing this amazing event. I start saying that this is part of a larger project that we are working on collaboration with our colleagues at UCSD as well. And I will read to not be lost on time. So the US-Mexico border has traditionally been a transit migration zone, but significant changes have occurred in the last 5 years. The diversification of the places of origin, a more substantial presence of women, minors, and accompanied minors. Likewise, the reinforcement of border control has led to a diversification of crossing strategies, adding to the flows of undocumented crossing, asylum seeking, or protection under the temporary protected status. In addition, and this is important but not very visible, there has been an increase in the number of waiting places and times. The pandemic has been a critical alibi to increase even more the stranding times. The conditions of strandedness is produced by, among other causes, the tightening of border controls, frequent changes in the laws and procedures governing asylum requests, and growing efforts by the Mexican government to take it harder for potential asylum seekers to travel through Mexico, in concert with a growing global tendency toward externalization of borders. Thus, migration strandedness is now a central aspect of the mechanisms for controlling migration in transit, both in the Americas and other contexts. For this reason, we considered it necessary to understand the implications of the lengthening of strandedness from the migrants' experience. This study is part of an ethnographic research project, Itinerarios sobre Salud y Migración, undertaken in 2019 in Tijuana, Baja California, Mexico. We primarily conducted fieldwork in one shelter for migrant families, which also functions as a cultural center. Its residents include children, youth, adults, and to a lesser degree, the elderly. They have a capacity for 25 persons approximately and provide different services to the migrant community living in and out of the shelter. We have follow-up on their situations at the border for periods that range from weeks to 2 years. We conducted an ethnographic observation at the shelter while developing a knitting workshop, attending cultural events, and teaching Spanish lessons. Based on our contact with the migrant community living in the shelter or receiving its services, we conducted 47 in-depth interviews in Spanish, English, and French. The participants in the study were primarily from Central America, the Caribbean, and Africa. Most of the participants were stranded in the border region either because they were waiting to start an asylum petition in the United States or were under the MPP. The rest were redefining their migration project, beginning a refuge petition in Mexico, finding possibilities to get temporary or permanent residency, looking from family reunification in Mexico, or waiting to cross the border undocumented. The condition of the migration project was not static in some cases, and individuals or families could move from an stranded condition to a redefinition of the project or vice versa. From a structural or systemic perspective, we can consider that the condition of strandedness is produced by the combined effect of different national states' migration policies, which configure what Michael Laguerre calls transnational management of undesirables. In essence, undesirable populations are pressured to leave certain territories and arrive to other countries where effective mechanisms to implement their reception are inexistent. It produces spaces of strandedness, which become visible with the appearance of refugee camps or overcrowded detention centers for immigrants. We argue that the increase in waiting times is not an unintended effect of the current migration policies. It is a control and deterrence strategy over migration. Therefore, migrants are stranded within their mobility rather than in waiting, which means that official and extra-official devices force them to remain for uncertain and extended periods in places they did not choose. There are some hotspots for migration strandedness in Mexico, which include its northern and southern borders. Both places of strandedness are part of what Campos called the Mexican transit control regime. We consider that understanding the devices that produce strandedness is essential, but it's not enough. In addition to analyzing the structural dimension that immobilizes population within their migration trajectories, it is necessary to add a phenomenological analysis that understands the experience of strandedness from asylum seekers and migrants' perspective. From our perspective, the condition of strandedness relates to the migration project. People are stranded when they cannot move forward to their destination places, neither backward to their home countries. Elsewhere, we propose that it is possible to identify at least 4 different types of strandedness based on the identification of the migration projects: truncated projects, deportees that cannot return to the host countries, neither have another place to go; in waiting projects, asylum seekers in Mexico or the United States under the MPP, or migrants that are unable to start an asylum petition due to border closures and restrictions; shifting projects in the face of the impossibility to continue the migration project. An alternative project is shaped during migration grief. Parallel projects, new migratory projects emerge under strandedness, and the former project also remains. Economic and emotional resources are invested to reach both, even knowing that they are exclusive. We would like also to talk about how strandedness occurs. In the specific case of the Mexican transit control regime, the most evident migration strandedness device is this in the South is operated by the Mexican Commission for Refugee Aid, forcing then tens of thousands of refugee claimants to face an uncertain wait in precarious conditions. On the northern border, where we mainly conducted this study, the main strandedness devices are those related to deportation, return, and removal, Title 42, as well as the provisions that affect those who attempt to apply for asylum in the US and must remain in Mexico before doing so. Some of the recent instruments that have lengthening waiting times are the closing of the border under the health contingency and the MPP. Others, less obvious, are related to the difficulty accessing the information on new legislation and the mechanisms to request asylum or the obligation to have a lawyer given the lack of resources and the fact that civil society organization lawyers working pro bono are overstretched. Some implications of strandedness we argue that strandedness means that people stranded within their mobility must remain for extended periods in stranding societies, not host societies. And these societies lack integration strategies and consider them persons in transit. Additionally, migrants struggle to concentrate their efforts and resources on their integration. But more profoundly, strandedness produces a tension between putting life on waiting for months or years and life that continues flowing or drawing on despite everything. Thus, for example, children stop going to school but continue growing. Migrants and asylum seekers remain in shelters or precarious houses because they are temporary, but time moves on for months or years without a worthy place to live. A chronic health problem has not been cared for because they have not arrived at the destination place to receive quality health care, hopefully. Nevertheless, the health problem continues to get worse. These tensions affect migrants' well-being, who from precariousness must develop strategies to cope with it. Matthews and Izquierdo propose that well-being is an optimal state of an individual, community, society, and the world as a whole. It is conceived of, expressed, and experienced in different ways by different individuals and within the cultural context of different societies. We're interested in approaching a perspective that addresses the individual, community, and social dimensions of well-being experiences in particular contexts and temporalities. To this end, it is necessary to understand the circumstances faced by migrants in places of strandedness and the meaning that time acquires in the course of these experiences, especially considering the uncertainty and indeterminacy they go through during the administrative procedures related to their migration processes. To approach the relationship between places of strandedness and well-being experiences, we consider it relevant to understand the social meaning that these places have, not only as a context in which well-being as an outcome emerges, but as places that are inherently relational in both its production and its influence. Places understood as relational requires attention to the processes that help to build a sense of community, social cohesion, and trust, and hence livability and so forth, an approach that has come to be labeled as placemaking and place shaping. The processes of placemaking and shaping have implications for well-being and can be identified through the opportunities and constraints migrants and asylum seekers experience while pursuing integration in places of strandedness. The following are some of the conditions experienced during strandedness that impact migrants and asylum seekers' well-being. First, mobility has implied the abandonment of life projects anchored in the place of origin. Although preserving one's life becomes a priority during mobility, people who migrate hope to achieve stability in the present and be extended into the future. However, the uncertainty of strandedness prevents stability from being accomplished. There are various losses, material and social, associated with the departure from the place of origin. Still, there is difficulty accessing resources, material, social, and political during the migration experience, allowing them to visualize viable life projects for the future. Under these circumstances, these populations may face a constant redefinition of their migration and life projects to find stability in the present from where they can project themselves into the future. We will share short vignettes from the story of some of our collaborators in this study. Together with her parents and sister, Karen fled violence in El Salvador. During her migration trajectory, she went through various emotional experiences and a suicide attempt. Derived both from the precariousness in which she found herself in Mexico and the abandonment of a life project that excited her and gave meaning to her life in her place of origin. The family redefined their migration project several times, started their refugee application in Mexico, and later abandoned it after experiencing violence in the country. Subsequently, they began applying for asylum in the US under the MPP. This implied making their living conditions precarious in an extended and indefinite manner to focus on a petition they were not sure they would obtain. Faced with the emotional and material exhaustion generated, they gave up the application and resume the refuge petition in Mexico again. They considered that it was a way that would allow them to get out of the strandedness condition, to rebuild their life projects with greater certainty in Mexico. In addition to the labor and educational opportunities they found at the Mexican border to develop feasible life projects. After being a victim of torture and extreme violence, Joy fled Cameroon, leaving behind her 4 children. Arriving at Mexico's southern border, she obtained, without applying for it, permanent residency as a stateless person. She now lives in Tijuana and faces a dilemma. Either she must turn to her legal status in Mexico to start the family reunification process and see her children relatively soon, even though she knows that Tijuana is not a safe place for them, or she must start the asylum process in the US, knowing that it will be a long time before she sees her children again. Faced with the dilemma, she builds parallel projects, which require investing financial and emotional resources that keep her exhausted for an indeterminate period. Often migrants face various challenges specific to the border region and their migratory status. Some continue to face multiple concerns due to the conditions their families are living in their places of origin, or need to care for family members traveling with them. In both circumstances, migrants encounter limitations in caring for family needs, which detriment their well-being. These experiences shed light on the communitarian and relational sense of well-being. Marcos flees El Salvador with his wife, 2 daughters, and mother after receiving death threats. Since leaving his place of origin, he assumes responsibility for taking care of his family's needs. For him, the asylum process under the MPP implied the confrontation of several unforeseen conditions, such as seeking help for his mother's health problems, his daughter's education, having access to a safe place to live, and providing emotional support for his family in the face of a long and uncertain process. Even though Mario is going through emotional difficulties, he tries to encourage his family, hiding his vulnerability to the situation. To confront his emotional condition, he resorts to religious practices, both to ask God's intercession on obtaining asylum and to maintain hope, as well as to recognize from his relationship with the sacred the emotional difficulties he's going through. After being subjected to violence by an extremist group, Seydou had to flee Burkina Faso, leaving his mother, his pregnant wife, and his son under the protection of his uncle. After a long and challenging journey, he reached Mexico, where he was granted refugee status and found a job to provide for his basic needs. A few months after living in Tijuana, his uncle was killed in a massacre in his place of origin. His family became helpless. So Seydou went to the Mexican Commission for Refugee Aid to request the refugee status for his family and get them out of Burkina as a matter of urgency. However, this commission, what she got was only confusing information and the warning. It is a procedure that takes between 7 months and a year. Seydou thought about the situation of danger and extreme defenselessness of his family and answered, "I don't know if in 7 months I will still have a family to bring." He's currently experiencing a severe depressive crisis. The condition of strandedness increases the needs they must meet. Therefore, the limitations they face to achieve social, cultural, and economic integration in the places of strandedness have implications for their well-being. In some cases, they experience the need to develop parallel migration projects, which implies the investment of significant financial and emotional resources with no certainty as to which, if any, of these projects will become real. Although he is only 18 years old, Aziz has already made the undocumented journey from Ghana, his birthplace, to this border twice. The first time he was deported while still a minor. Now, while he waits for the opportunity to apply for asylum, he works in the parking lot of a supermarket in Tijuana, where he spends his time making plans while working. One day, he dreams of bringing a wife from Ghana that his family would choose for him. Another day, he thinks about revalidating his school diplomas to continue studying in Tijuana and attend university in the future. But he also plans to enlist in the Mexican army to secure a livelihood. And at the same time, he longs for all these dreams, for which he invests energy and emotions, they could be suspended if he's authorized to cross the border to seek asylum in the US. Carville strives to learn Spanish, obtain decent housing, and improve his job to receive his family in better conditions. He went through the lengthy and costly reunification family process under the National Immigration Institute as an stateless person. At the same time, Carville invested time and money to apply for asylum in the US. Finally, the timing works out, and he manages to combine both projects. Once his family arrives in Tijuana, he gets the support of a sponsor to cross the border, so they all cross together. Then they begin a new and long waiting process in the US with the illusion of being granted asylum.
2 minutes.
As a conclusion remarks, we would like to share some ideas. For people who have fled violence, a central aspect of well-being is inhabiting spaces where they can safeguard their lives. However, preserving life in conditions of strandedness continue to undermine well-being. Addressing strandedness, spatial and temporal conditions, allow us to identify asylum seekers' needs to experience well-being. Spatial conditions are not limited to the material resources available, but to the subjective meanings that the space acquires for migrants' populations as places from which it is possible to sustain a life project aligned with their well-being perspective. The indeterminacy of strandedness, temporality, exacerbates the uncertainty of concluding the migration project, undermining well-being. We identify 3 aspects relevant for migrants' well-being while being stranded: to maintain or redefine migration projects that will allow them to build affordable and desirable life projects, to keep or recover the family unit and integrity, and to gain access to social, cultural, and economic resources in the context of the strandedness, allowing them to experience integration amidst indeterminate uncertainty. Well-being for asylum seekers in conditions of strandedness is not limited to meeting their basic needs in the present. However, to the possibilities they have in the world to develop dignified life projects in contexts where they could be attainable. While the tension between putting the life in waiting and the life that continues drawing on is not solved, the conditions for a dignified life project are not granted. Thank you for listening.
Questions? Okay.
It's really exciting work, Olga. So I guess I would be interested in your thoughts on what Derek Sila presented earlier about detention centers and the harms of conditions there compared again to this, forever waiting and never being able to integrate and putting your resources for the survival in such a dangerous situation on the border when migrants get stuck there. So, how do you think about these 2 options and what are the implications?
Well, we have shown with these stories as well, and this is something that we continue to explore with the people there, that of course there is all these hard situations they are dealing with, but also the way they manage, they find ways to cope with it amidst this very hard situation. So when we talk about strandedness, it's just to highlight that they are sometimes waiting, but they don't know what they are waiting for. So they are like having different directions they could go, but they don't have the certainty that these directions are really viable for them. So it's a condition where they are struggling every day, trying to cope with that and finding ways to endure these situations. So I think that that's something, these tensions are present always in their daily life, and it has to do with these different situations they are dealing with and low possibilities of dealing with them and the constrictions. So it's a very dynamic situation that, as we said, like it undermines well-being in that sense. They can have stability at some point, but then again, instability. So it's a very fluent situation.
Oh, can I say something? Um, I just want to say that I totally understand what you're saying. I'm counseling someone from Jordan. Actually, he's Palestinian, and his family are stuck in Jordan, and he's here by himself. He has 4 kids, 3 girls, 1 boy, and his wife. So he's very worried about them. He did seek asylum, and then he doesn't know what's going to happen. Exactly what you're saying, and he's I totally fear everything that you're saying because I'm counseling him, and he's having a really hard time. He's depressed. He wants his family. He's worried about them, and he's like, his wife works, but it's not even that. It's an emotional, psychological being away from the family, missing on his children growing up. He doesn't know his children. What's camera and phone? That's nothing, right? Like he talks to them with a camera and a phone. So I totally understand everything that you're saying, and it's very difficult for him. I try to support him. I'm his psychologist, but it's devastating. I totally understand what you're saying because I see how he is, and like you said, there's no hope. There's no way out, just no hope. He doesn't know what to do. And if he goes back, he's going to go to jail because of, the Palestinian Authority working with Israel and all the stuff. So he's going to go to jail just because he's fighting for his country and all the stuff. The political situation over there. So he cannot go back because he'll go to jail, and he cannot leave his family, like young kids and a wife. That's probably a similar situation to what you're talking about. So thank you. It's a very important point that you're touching on.
Thank you for this comment.
Thank you very much for that. I was really struck by the young person who has so many different options: marriage with somebody who gets chosen for him, learning Spanish and going to school and university, crossing the border to see his father. So that is like 3 totally different kind of strategies all going on at the same time in his mind. But I haven't thought about this for a long time, but I remember when I was interviewing Afghan families about mental health, especially the young adolescents, they were saying to me, and I think it's interesting because the next presentation is on trauma, that mental health is not determined by the past, but by the future. Because it's the narrative and the meaning making and the articulation of coherence between the past, the present, and the future. And so if the future has no coherence, you have very poor mental health. Mm-hmm. So I think you just reminded me of that. Thank you. In the sense that, it's not so much, we're very often thinking about the past and the present as a determinant of health, but we very rarely think about the future as a determinant for mental health.
Yeah, thank you. This is an interesting comment because we found that they are carrying all the issues they live in their home countries as well. But at the same time, they left with a hope to find a better place, to find a stability, to start again their life projects. And yes, when this future is not very clear, is uncertain, and it's probably not feasible from their own desires or what they want in their life, this is what it becomes like for them, very shocking and detriments their conditions, of course.
I just want to add to what you're saying. There's no hope that they will get an asylum. It's just maybe. So they know it's maybe. It's not for sure they will live in the U.S., correct?
Yes, and that's why some of them try to find other strategies, like crossing undocumented and not requesting asylum. They are just going to or change the project and stay in Mexico, even if they are dealing with other precarities, but at least they have for sure something. So it's very clear how they are like handling and trying to struggle with that.
I think that it's very interesting that there's a time and a space dimension to this. The idea of being stranded in space and suspended in time. Mm-hmm. Yet it doesn't mean that they're frozen. Mm-hmm. And this is why I really like the idea of project, the way you're thinking of things in terms of having a project. Because, you know, and that they have multiple, that they're thinking constantly and improvising, right? Improvising and strategizing. So in that way, having a project goes around or sidesteps the idea even of agency, and it sidesteps even the idea of hope. Because you can have a project with very little hope, right? But you're still trying to figure things out. So I do very much like this idea of thinking in terms of projects, even beyond the idea of agency or hope.
Yeah. And how the migration project is quietly intertwined with the life project as well. So it's like seeing these dimensions of their experience that are overlapped as well. Thank you for this comment.
Can I ask a quick question? Do you know, I know a family in Mexico and they're trying to get in the US and seeking asylum. That's possible? They come in the border or they won't let them in the border. I don't know how that goes. Do you know?
Yes, well, it has changed a lot over the time. A lot of people was rejected, and before it seems that in the Tijuana San Isidro border there was no way to request asylum, but then the process have changed in 2016 and 2017. There was a big amount of people requesting asylum, so the Mexican National Immigration Institute, they started like with a notebook with a waiting list just to start a petition. So they were not starting the petition yet, but there was a list and they were called by numbers. Then that changed, and now the procedure is quite different. They should do this through an organization and ask for a parole, and it has changed a lot.
It's a Mexican organization and they ask for parole, you're saying?
Yes, and a civil society organization based there.
Oh, okay.
So it has changing a lot.
Yes. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Olga.
Thank you.
All right. Our next speaker is Dr. Hans Reiling, who is a psychotherapist in private practice and an assistant professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology campus here in San Diego. He has also provided mental health services to asylum seekers through Survivors of Torture International. Hans's talk today is called Trauma Loops, U.S. Immigration Detention and Reverse Causality in PTSD. Hans Reiling.
Something you could text. Okay. No, I can call, but I don't know if I had to add the number before.
All right, thank you. It's been a long day with a lot of rich information, and so I'll try to go slow here and talk about immigration detention, and particularly this place here, Otay Mesa Detention Center, where I conducted more than 30 forensic mental health evaluations before the pandemic. And just want to first of all locate this place also in urban space, 25 miles southeast at the outskirts of San Diego. And it's a peculiar place where not many San Diegans would go. It's grouped together with the state prison and juvenile detention facility. And it's actually only 2 miles from the US-Mexican border. So Otay Mesa Detention Center was established in 2015 and is operated by CoreCivic, a for-profit company that was formerly called the Corrections Corporation of America. And this company actually started the first for-profit private prison in the United States in the 1980s, and has since then expanded its reach also into the immigration system. And the facility has contracts with ICE and the US Marshal Service, and most of the detainees, though, are asylum seekers. So in 2020, there was an average daily population of 730 detainees with a maximum capacity of 1,142 in the facility. And I'm also, in a minute, I'm going to say a little bit more about how this changed in the wake of COVID-19. Average stay has been like about 3 months, but I have also worked with detainees who had to stay there for much longer than a year. And this practice of immigration detention is relatively new historically, and it started in the 1990s, and especially after the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act was passed during the Bill Clinton administration. And in that act that is now part of Title VIII, there's it specifically stated that people who wait for their court case, they shall be detained. And we know it's not always applied, but it is often for so-called arriving aliens who come to the border. At least it was that was the case pre-pandemic. And so, and another impact was the Homeland Security Act. And I would say, like, immigration detention must really be seen in the larger context of the US prison industrial complex and the criminalization of immigrants. And if you look at the numbers since the 90s, the number of detained asylum seekers constantly are immigrants, most of them are asylum seekers, went up to 50,000, I think, even like in 2019, up from 5,000 or 6,000 in 1994. And since the pandemic started, the numbers went down. These are the figures from Otay Mesa Detention Center. At the beginning of last year, there were 700 detainees, went down, and right now, like, there are even less people in there. One would think it's a good thing, but it's actually not, because like during the past year, like more than 1 million people have been denied the right to asylum when coming to the border under Title 42. So what's the significance of these forensic mental health evaluations? So asylum seekers have very slim chances of actually succeeding at court. About like 90% of applicants who don't have an attorney are denied. And this means that it's really important to have legal counsel, and attorneys always seek for evidence in the face of, often not having much at their hand. So a mental health evaluation has become actually a sort of a political capital that can be used to get asylum. And although the right to asylum does not depend on a mental health diagnosis, such diagnosis enhances the chances of success at the immigration court. So aid organizations and their attorneys recruit mental health clinicians to evaluate their clients in the hope of establishing credibility. And immigration judges use these evaluations to determine the credibility of the asylum seeker's narrative. Doesn't mean that if somebody has an evaluation and is diagnosed with PTSD also gets asylum, but the chances are much higher from everything that I have heard from attorneys that I've worked with. So now I conducted 32 of these evaluations at Otay Mesa. And usually an evaluation includes a semi-structured interview, and people go through the Hopkins symptom checklist and the PTSD checklist for DSM-5. And all of the people that have been referred to me, almost all of them, like 31 out of 32 met DSM-5 diagnosis, a diagnosis for PTSD, and almost all of them also for major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. And here I have a picture of DSM-5, just also to point out that this is a cultural artifact, which has like certain ideas around how PTSD works. And the main idea is to establish a link between a past event and current mental health symptoms. And I'm going to get to that in a moment. So there are the different criteria: the exposure to the traumatic event, intrusion, avoidance, alterations in cognition and mood, arousal and reactivity. Those are the main ones. And usually they can be seen in this linear sort of model. So this model is based on an idea that memory could basically be stored in human beings, like just like on a disk or a hard drive, and it's just in there. And from there later on, these re-experiencing symptoms and flashbacks come up, and then also the rest of the symptoms. So current circumstances or events are blended out in favor of a past etiological event. And a lot of mental health clinicians know that this is not really how it works, because memory is more complicated. And I see it as a sort of a looping, where the current circumstances can actually provoke these re-experiencing symptoms and lead to new traumatic experiences depending on what's going on in the environment. And in the context of detention, traumatic memories that might have had mild effects on a person or no effects at all might be triggered during detention. And a lot of the detainees I talked to, they tried to do something about that. And they wanted to basically not remember, and not have these negative intrusive thoughts. So what they did was they signed up for so-called volunteer work with CoreCivic. And I'm going to present a couple of quotes now. So I have here transgender woman from Honduras. And she said, I wasn't able to feel happy since I came here. I like to dance and I like to listen to music. I like to socialize, but I don't feel like doing it here. When I sing, it makes me feel better and I forget about the past. But then the guards come and tell me to stop. I don't understand why. I always like to sing, it relaxes me, but here I can't. I can't even get a hug from my trans friend because it's prohibited. That makes me sad. When I go out, I'm always alone. I don't communicate because I'm afraid of man. And you see here like some of the experiences she had in her home country. And sometimes I clean the floor, she said. I wanted to be occupied with something. I wanted to do something during the day, and I thought if I had work, I could distract myself. But they put me on night shift. I cleaned the floor from 11 p.m. to 12 a.m. And I'd sleep longer if I didn't depend on the schedule. When I wasn't working, I would go to bed at 10. I would sleep at 11 and get up at 5 for breakfast. I started 2 weeks ago with the work, and since then, I'm not having breakfast anymore. I feel like I'm losing weight. For 1 week, I haven't been eating breakfast. This is one example of an experience, and another one here from a 35-year-old cisgender man from Anglophone Cameroon, and he had a bachelor's degree in his country, and he said, I signed up to clean the bathroom 5 times a week to keep myself busy and not think about Cameroon. The main reason is to keep myself from thinking about the past. When I started working, I was not thinking of money because it's not money for me in comparison to what I made as an accountant in Cameroon. I work 5 days a week and they give me $5, but the check is actually $4. We don't look at our hours because we just want to keep ourselves busy. A lot of people who do that job think like me. My salary was more than $1,000 as a consultant, and I was fine. I wanted to build my own home. But here, cleaning is a good thing because it keeps me busy. You're not thinking negatively only if the toilets are not flushing and there's a big mess. Sometimes I get very disturbed when people are not cleaning after themselves. When I see the toilet that's not flushing and it's full of feces, it reminds me of the torture back in my country. And this was a man who was put into a bucket of feces and urine to simulate drowning. So I have more of these stories, but basically they speak to the conditions at Otay Mesa Detention Center and the sort of labor exploitation that takes place there. This other vignette would be about a man who felt he had to earn some money through this program that they provided in order to buy food from the commissary, because he said you can't really eat that food. The food is pretty bad. So he had to work to get some noodles from the prison shop. So these are the type of conditions. And
2 minutes, Hans.
okay. And recently, even ICE found violations of its standards in the facility. They didn't point out the labor exploitation and the problems with access to medical care, but they did point out problems with the facility not enforcing COVID-19 guidelines and some other problems. Now, interestingly, since the pandemic, the numbers dropped, but ICE has a contract with CoreCivic and guarantees to pay for at least 750 beds. Now, the detainee population went down, and you see here in April 2020, an average cost of daily cost was $186. In March 2021, it was 339. Because at that time, there were like, I think about 400 detainees. And I have some more information here about the COVID response in the detention center. It was last year when the first COVID-19 death in US immigration detention occurred. And the person, the man, 58-year-old Carlos Mejia, he actually fled El Salvador in the 80s, and he had been in the United States for a while, was detained, and the beginning of the pandemic, he was protesting against the CoreCivic's COVID response. He went on hunger strike because they didn't provide testing. There were problems with actually isolating people who had symptoms. They wanted people to sign releases in order to get masks. So he participated in a hunger strike. He was put in segregation, which means solitary confinement. And then later found he had COVID-19, and then he was released and taken to Paradise Valley Hospital, where he eventually died on a ventilator. So this is my alarm at my 20 minutes. Thank you for listening, and hope you have questions for me. I didn't get to the alternatives to detention, but please.
Hi, thank you very much. Could you talk to us about alternatives to detention?
And also a little bit more about the COVID-19. There you go. We gave you the opening to
Okay.
say the rest of what you wanted to say.
I mean, there are some stats here about COVID-19. And, this is a picture also from, I'm going to do one after the other. That's a picture that was taken by a guard through the surveillance camera, and in February 2021. And you see here that obviously masks were not enforced, social distancing was not enforced. And eventually ICE found out, and they're now fining the facility for it. So, and there's more to say about that, but when you think about alternatives to detention, there was this really interesting study like in the 1990s when the Vera Institute of Justice demonstrated that people who are just able to be in a community environment and participate in this appearance assistance program, they were actually more likely to appear at court than the people on parole or on bail. So most of the people, they actually showed up. So they said, like, what's the point to detain all these asylum seekers? And obviously the government didn't really listen because the number of detainees went up. But the idea of alternatives to detention was taken up. And it was put in the hands of another private company, different private companies. One of the biggest ones is the GEO Group with its behavioral interventions program that is responsible for the surveillance and monitoring of people who wait for their trial through all these different methods with the Smart Link, that's like through the phone and taking the photos and the GPS monitoring and so forth. And the surveillance is actually increasing. So in the fiscal year of 2020, there was an allocated 149 million for this type of surveillance. Now for 21, it's a 440 million. So you see, like, there's heavy investment into these technologies. And just one more thing I wanted to share here in that regard is the experience of a man who had the ankle monitor bracelet on his foot for about 2 years, and it was malfunctioning, and it was going off at night over a period of time, several times. And each time he could feel the ankle monitor go off, he would have traumatic re-experiencing symptoms, and it was horrible for this man. He got some treatment, psychiatric treatment, and he was part of a man's group with Survivors of Torture International. But it was a situation. We couldn't do much for him because he would go to ISAP, that's a program, and report that what's going on, but nobody believed it. And he said, they're just not listening to you. And I had this, I heard the same thing from other survivors. And if you look at it, I mean, on average, there's one case manager for 125 participants in the program. So I'm gonna stop here. And, oh, actually, I had some concluding thoughts also. So, but I can leave that open, or if you want to hear them, I can add them.
Well, do we have any questions other than asking you to tell us your concluding thoughts?
I do have one question for you. Thank you so much for your presentation and the work that you're doing. The Tacit Project has been collecting a lot of data on provider well-being, and one of the themes that has come up is a stronger connection between legal services and psychological services due to psychological evaluations being such a big part of the asylum process. I'm wondering if you agree, and if you could speak about how we can improve this process on top of, dismantling MPP and no longer requiring detention.
Yeah, I think like it's key to collaborate with attorneys, and actually Survivors of Torture International has a yearly provider meeting where immigration attorneys, mental health clinicians, and medical doctors come together and talk about the latest developments. And I mean, it's key for us also to know what's going on the legal side, what kind of information they need. So yeah, it's a good point. I think it's really important.
There's a comment.
So yeah, I just want to say like more research is needed to understand how present moment embodiment determines the course of post-traumatic stress after torture in the US immigration system. And the post-traumatic is really like often a misnomer for what's going on with the people in the system. I just have a comment, final comment here from another panelist, Kristen Yaris, who says the violence of these forms of body restraint like ankle monitors is important to address. The degrees of carceral care and punishment, surveillance from total control inside the detention facilities to these remote forms of surveillance by app or foot monitor are so important to understand the trauma loops you are describing. And she thanks you for the presentation. Thank you for the comment.
Can I add one thing, please? Can I add one thing?
Okay, last comment.
I had a client who had an ankle monitor. He's from Jordan, and he used to wear pants to make sure it's covered because he said, this is very embarrassing, shameful. I look like a criminal. I did something wrong. I'm not a criminal, all this stuff. And he comes from a good family in Jordan. And he was like, this is so traumatizing for me. He always had a hard time about it. And he was talking to me about it. And he didn't know if he was going to say or not. But the ankle monitor, I agree with you, was devastating for him.
Yeah, we have patients, like they're terrified to just go to the office and getting that ankle monitor. They think they're afraid of getting it. And yeah, so
they think they're criminals, right?
Thank you. Our final presenter is Dr. Tala Al-Russan, who is an assistant professor in the School of Public Health here at UC San Diego. She is also worked as a volunteer physician with Doctors Without Borders and with the Syrian American Medical Society. She conducts work to improve the health of refugees from the Middle East and Afghanistan. And her title is Refugees on the Move, Health Along the Migratory Route Between Syria and California. Tala.
Being a refugee is much more than a political status. It is the most pervasive kind of cruelty that can be exercised against a human being. You are forcibly robbing this human being of all aspects that would make human life not just tolerable, but meaningful in many ways.
The more immune you are to people's suffering, that's very, very dangerous. It's critical for us to maintain this humanity.
الان 60 روزه با پسرم همینطوری داریم میچرخیم ولی هیچ کس نیستش که بگه یه راهی رو بخواد به ما نشون بده. کجا برم زندگیمو شروع کنم؟
If children grow up without any hope, without any prospects for the future, without any sense of them being able to make something out of their lives, then they will become very vulnerable to all sorts of exploitation, including radicalization.
ليش انتوا هنا اليوم؟
طشه احنا الفصل المنفذ الوحيد في غزة في السجن الكبير غزة مش في غزة السجن كبير يعني.
The officials came here and told them, look, there's no way you're going to get papers to continue. Either you go voluntarily or we arrest you.
I respect you. I respect the passport and I respect you.
It's going to be a big challenge to recognize that the world is shrinking and people from different religions, different cultures are going to have to learn to live with each other.
I hope you guys have some energy left in you. After the last presentation, I'm hoping to shift gears a little bit to talk about a story of hope, hopefully, in some way moving forward, thinking about this global crisis. So just a reminder, since some new people are joining in from online and here with us today, I have Moj and Banan here, who are my research assistants, refugees from Iraq and from Syria, perfect rock stars who have been working with me for the past 3 years to start some initiatives here in San Diego. So just a reminder, we have never seen these numbers before in the world, right, of refugees and people who are forcibly displaced. We are at 82.4 million people who are displaced, and of those, about 27 million are believed to be refugees. There are 4 million people who are stateless, right? Just living completely on the margins of society. Now, 2/3 of the world's refugees, all the world's refugees, come from 5 countries. Those are Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. We know that there are raising inequalities, especially with the pandemic now. We're sitting in a state here in California where a few people are controlling the majority of the global wealth, right? The entire wealth of the world. We know that the pandemic has increased their wealth while also has increased a lot of suffering for people and displacement. We know also that climate change is real, and we feel it here in the United States, and we feel it also in different parts of the world, especially in the Middle East where I come from, where there's a huge drought problem and extreme weathers. Raising conflicts all over the world, so more and more people will be displaced. So these numbers are expected to keep growing. And this is just to map out the world's refugee population. So the major producers of the world's refugees, Syria, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Myanmar, Somalia, South Sudan. However, most of the global refugee burden is borne by the global South, countries like where I come from, Jordan, that are limited in resources themselves. So let's keep that in mind, that most of these refugees live in parts of the world that are struggling themselves. This is also a reminder to all of us and has been discussed before in other talks, but this is the socio-ecological model of health. That's how we think of health. It's not just, your age, sex, hereditary factors, it's so many other things. And migration cuts across all of these layers. So really migration is a social determinant of health. And in my opinion, it is completely understudied and not looked at as a real determinant of health. It's also important to say that when we research refugees, we should think of all of these, the place of origin, what happened to them before they took their journey, what happened during travel and transit, their place of destination, and whether they will return or not. So keeping these kind of cross-cutting aspects also is very important in conducting research with refugees. So the title of my talk is really thinking about migration or displacement as a dynamic process. So what I'm hoping to do, and what we've seen from other presenters, that a lot of the refugees that stop in Jordan, a country so far from here, end up here in San Diego. So our research should somehow compare and start thinking of it as a dynamic process, right, along the migratory route. So if we think of refugee health research, including all of these aspects, I think we can produce better research. This is a picture of Damascus in 2009. This is where we used to go for dinners and lunches, beautiful food. So Damascus is believed to be the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. That dates back to 11,000 years. It was beautiful. In 2011, these are the pictures we're seeing from Damascus. I forget a lot, and I'm only 41. So why am I so forgetful? So I really started looking at the literature, seeing whether displacement and trauma-related displacement increases the risk of dementia. There was almost nothing at all in the literature. So I felt as a healthcare provider, I am not able to give her the answers she seeks. And that's why I started shifting my career more towards research and thinking, how could we as epidemiologists, as healthcare researchers, help these populations through science? So again, thinking of migration as a dynamic process and these mobile populations moving across the countries. So we have here Morgan, who's going back and getting some stuff from refugee families back there. And when she comes back, she does the same thing. Also thinking about health the same way. These people are mobile populations. I have almost not encountered a single refugee who didn't want to return back to their country. They almost all say, we wish we could return back to Syria. We wish we could return back to Iraq. So hoping that more comparative studies between both locations could tell us something about the health of these mobile populations. So we have some research in Jordan that is looking at health needs of older Syrian refugees in camps and outside camps. So they're very different populations. Those who live in refugee camps are usually poorer. Those who cannot sustain living outside, they're usually sicker. They don't have access to employment, right? And they don't have a perfect access for education. There are some schools, primary, elementary schools, but those who live in the community have different needs as well. They don't have the access to healthcare the same way it is in refugee camps where things are more contained, where NGOs kind of offer more help and it's easier to access those NGOs. So very different needs for refugees in camps versus outside camps. I am also trying to answer that question, whether mental health trauma impacts cognition over time. This is a question that hasn't been researched. And I think in the context of the Syrian crisis, this would be a very interesting question to look at, since the type of trauma that this population has endured is severe, and it's sudden, and it happened recently. So we are able to follow these people over time. Finally, here in San Diego, I'm hoping to look at implementation science. So taking interventions to the community of refugees and seeing whether it works or not. So this is a little bit different than the epidemiological cohort study that is going on in Jordan, but also experimenting with how a population of refugees here would accept a culturally sensitive implementation project, given that a lot of my team are refugees themselves and are embedded in the society here. Finally, we're also looking at COVID-19 impact on refugees, and I'll share with you more of this particular study's results. So I've had some early research with similar populations before, the population of the prisoners population. I did research of mobile home trailers. I did research for the homeless population. And I'm always thinking about institutionalization, right? So I'm thinking of detainment, containment. How does that impact brain health? How does that impact different health outcomes? So there are a lot of similarities between these different populations. And I just wanted to point out that, a lot of us, seeking grant funding, et cetera, I get from grant reviewers, but you know, the refugee population, how many are there out there? So what I want to say is that a lot of learnings that could happen from this population could be applied to other similar populations. So I'm focusing most of my research, how does displacement impact chronic disease management over time? You know, we've learned a lot from orphanages about the performance of children who have lived most of their life in orphanages and how that impacts cognition over time. So I'm hoping to do the same thing in the Zaatari refugee camp. The Zaatari refugee camp is truly a village on its own. So you can't see the end of it when you walk inside. And there's a lot of innovation there, restaurants going on, you know, wedding venues, life goes on, even if it's a refugee camp. However, now that we're conducting a lot of our interviews, like I talked to Catherine the other day, the words, you know, there are some certain words like feeling like I'm in prison, feeling like I'm pressured, feeling I'm like I lack freedom, although I'm able to walk around. So, you know, a lot of the research, again, is trying to see what are the aspects of encampment or institutionalization that impacts one's perception of health, and thus their health behaviors, and thus their adoption of different health interventions, right? Because it's highly, highly interrelated. So this is a map of Jordan, and many of you might not know this, but Jordan is the second largest refugee resettlement country per capita in the world. So 1 in 3 people in Jordan is a refugee. Historically, it was called the East Bank, and Israel-Palestine was the West Bank. So Jordan has been formed as a country to receive a lot of refugees, historically from Palestine, Iraq, and as you can see, all the neighboring countries of Jordan are countries suffering from conflict in a way or another. And this has been mentioned also in some of the talks before, but about 85% of Syrian refugees live outside camps. So they speak the similar dialects to Jordanians. They're embedded in the community, while 15% live in refugee camps. This is our publication with the WHO East Mediterranean Journal, really characterizing the different health needs of refugees, those who live in camps versus those who live outside camps. This was the first paper to really start thinking about, you know, those who live in camps, what kind of needs would they have compared to those who live outside camps? Many of them are mobile too, right? So they leave during the day to work outside, then they come back to the camp. They spend their weekends in the refugee camp. So we did a mixed method study and really thought about the health priorities from the perspective of refugees for those inside camps versus outside camps. And this is Dr. Bernard Lown at Harvard, who is my mentor and who supported this work. And I like to always remember his quote here: "We physicians who shepherd human life from birth to death have a moral imperative to resist with all our being the drift toward the brink. The threatened inhabitants on this fragile planet must speak out for those yet unborn, for posterity has no lobby with politicians." These are some images from our research. As you can tell, there's a males group and females group, so we kind of interview both. This is an aerial image of the Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan.
Alice, step closer to the microphone.
Oh. So now switching, taking you back to San Diego here. Many of you might not know this also, but San Diego is a large refugee resettlement hub, one of the largest in the country. There was a US Immigration Policy Center here that produced this report showing that 1/3 of San Diego's essential workers were immigrants, and that the fastest growing foreign-born populations here are from Syria, Kenya, Sudan, Iraq, and Nigeria. We continue to be resettling the largest number of Syrians in the country here in San Diego. And now we're expected to resettle one of the largest amount of Afghanis too.
2 minutes, Tella.
Okay. Just the story of what happens to refugees when they come here. So they arrive at the airport here in San Diego. The HHS, the Office of Refugee Coordination, whom you've heard from during this conference, takes care of them for 30 to 90 days only, basically screening them, connecting them to different services. And then those refugees are sent to certain enclaves here in San Diego, El Cajon, City Heights, where 23 to 30% of all residents in those areas live below the poverty line. The majority of refugees who live here are East African or Middle Eastern. However, the social fabric in San Diego is very unique in that, as you heard also during this conference from the San Diego Refugee Coalition, they formed a group of ethnic community-based organizations that came together and thought, okay, now these refugees are left on their own to navigate a whole country, a whole system. What can we as NGOs, ECBOs, what can we do? And then the Family Healthcare Center of San Diego is the main health providers. It's not us at UC Health here. It's these federally qualified healthcare centers. There's no tertiary care, so it's primary care. And we are now researching a lot of the issues that they're facing in terms of working with refugees. So a lot of the cultural insensitivity, language barriers that come up, transportation barriers, those are all now we're trying to characterize in our research. Another question that came up, CVD, cardiovascular disease, how does it impact refugees? Or are refugees at higher risk for developing cardiovascular disease just solely because of being refugee? That's a question that has not been answered. So we recently conducted this meta-analysis to isolate the effect of displacement on cardiovascular disease and different risk factors. And we saw that yes, being a refugee only after you adjust for so many other things does impact your risk of CVD. So you are at a higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease if you are a refugee. Now, the main project that we're conducting here in San Diego that Benin and Mauj are part of, we are teaching refugees how to measure their blood pressure at home and keep track of their measurements in a diary. And we're seeing whether they like doing this or not. So basically taking healthcare to refugees' homes, since a lot of the barriers that they deal with have to do with language, transportation, not feeling welcome at the healthcare setting, not having somebody to navigate care with. So we're basically taking the technology out there by having them wear connected blood pressure monitors so that their providers can see their readings and make decisions related to healthcare, to medications based on these readings. This is a study looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the community. So in partnership with the Partnership for Advancement of New Americans, PANA, which is one of the ECBOs here, we conducted the survey by phone just to kind of have an understanding of what's going on with the pandemic here with the Refugee Society. So we surveyed 191 African refugees and about 258 Middle Eastern refugees. As you can see from this demographics table, most of these refugees don't own their home. They're renting their homes, okay? Most of them are living in economic hardship. Many of them are unemployed. Most of them don't speak English at home. Most of them have children. Okay, this is just to tell you, we asked them if they're bothered by emotional problems, and 47% of them said yes. We also looked at aspects of COVID-19 stress, community stress, that are really correlated with that. And for the African refugee community, it was that families are unable to get cash for daily expenses. They can't have enough food, and their children are unable to continue their studies at home. For Middle Eastern refugees, they are reporting more violence in the household because of the pandemic. And they were also reporting that people are becoming more anxious and depressed in their household. Those all correlated with their own mental health. Finally, I just think, leaving on a positive note, I think there is a lot of room for innovation, opportunities. Clinical care, we can do a lot for clinical care. trauma-informed care, more cultural sensitivity, kind of thinking of a model where community health workers can be embedded and refugee-focused. They can be refugees themselves. Many of the physicians that have been physicians before and are displaced can work as community health workers. Advocacy should be multi-layered, cross-sector, equity, social and political determinants of health, justice, innovation, and team-based care and policies. These are our collaborating organizations and us doing research here. And thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think that you were right. You were ending on a positive note, a note of hope. Placing you last on the agenda, I didn't have that intention because I didn't know what you were going to say, but it's a wonderful serendipity. And I think one of the best places to leave us is just to reiterate the last things that you had on your last slide: clinical care, advocacy, equity, justice. If we have those things, and if we encourage those things and promote those things, all of our work will not be in vain. And that includes the energy we've put into the last 2 days. So strong ringing endorsement of those 4 points.
I have a question. I'm so thrilled to see your science and all the ways in which you are leading. And it just makes me think about, how do we get more people from a refugee experience on the pipeline to being leaders and being, at the table setting the research agenda? And, what are the barriers and facilitators? What can you tell us about that so that we can diversify, who's really in the lead here? Because I think people like you are the future.
Thank you, Teresa. So I have Moj here, who has been a rock star, 2 times refugee herself from Iraq. And she has really helped us shape everything. She has taken on this job with a lot of passion. And she's now applying for a residency to become a family medicine resident. And she was looking for research experience. She reached out to us, and Moj has been a rock star and has helped us a lot. So I think, Teresa, being deliberate in who you hire is really key. And I think there are a lot of assets out there and a lot of refugees that are looking for opportunities to be part of this, to shaping their own narrative, shaping the research that's being done with them. So, being deliberate in how you present them on the leadership, not just on collect data or do things, but really, how do you grow so that you become a physician and carry on this experience with you? Or if you stay in the academia and want to continue a career as a refugee, surfing refugee yourself, how do you lead forward? And that's what we're trying to do here. So I want to always emphasize that, please, if you can, put them in leadership positions, they are the best to carry this mantle.
Can I just say a comment? I want to agree with you. You touched on the same point that I was talking about, dignity and giving refugees, a lot of power to do things, and how they feel low self-esteem because of the loss of status. They were doctors or engineers or successful students in Iraq or Syria or other countries. And it's good to give them a chance, and the dignity and how their self-esteem would improve tremendously if given a chance. And they're very hard workers and they could do a lot. I agree with you.
Not just give them a chance, but make them you, make them instead of you.
Yes.
Having the humility, the professional humility to really understand
that
nobody understands someone's pain unless they were in that.
That's
position.
true. That's true.
Final question. I was just wondering if you're looking at the suffering and memory loss with different populations inside camps, outside camps.
Yeah, so that project that we didn't talk a lot about, that's looking at mental health effect on cognition, we are really looking at exactly that. So we're looking at PTSD, anxiety, different mental health outcomes or exposures, and we're testing cognition using a tablet. So really through MoCA also, which is a battery used to test cognition. So yes, we are looking at that, and that's a huge study. That's a cohort that we're building. One of the things also that is lacking in refugee health is the longitudinal research. Most of the research on refugee health is cross-sectional, meaning you take one snapshot time at what's happening, and then you leave and carry on in another location, another project. So I'm kind of really hoping to continue with the same group over time so that we are able to have a better, cause-effect relationship and be able to comment on a lot of those. Thank you.
I want to add just a brief comment. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's so interesting and valuable. And also to acknowledge you being involved as refugees in all this process. And I was thinking about some migrants that in the Mexican side, a few of them that are interested on being lawyers just to fight for migrants' rights as well. And I was thinking in your experiences, if the experience of being a refugee was something that transformed your life project, something that you became interested on being involved on these issues after being refugee, and which were the opportunities. I was thinking about a specific girl in Tijuana that after giving her testimony in different panels was offered a grant to study law in a private university in Tijuana. So it was the result of being voicing other migrants.
Right.
And I wanted to know the way you became involved and the opportunities you found.
Right. I don't know, Moj, if you'd like to speak about your own experience and how, your career kind of led you to this work, but I can speak about my own. I'm a daughter of refugees, and there was not a single day on the dinner table that we didn't talk about that, lingering to going back home and how that impacts different things. My dad, his parents were from Syria, and he moved when he was a little child as a political asylum seeker to Jordan. And he would always, he's hypertensive, diabetic, and he doesn't take his medications on time. So I'm like, Dad, you need to keep up with your medications. He's like, life is not worth it, after what's happening to Syria and not being able to go back. So as a physician, I couldn't help but think of, again, the trauma and the baggage that patients carry with them and how that impacts their health decisions. So when I became a physician, I was also morphing very slowly to, again, the struggle of mine trying to answer questions of my dad's situation. Why isn't he taking his medications? Is it really related to what happened to his parents and his ancestors and what he's carrying with him? So yes, personal experience do play a big major role. And it makes you not want to quit. I was, again, in my career, my professional career, I was always pushed to do something else, but I would keep coming back and try to get funding and try to work on refugee health because I know that there's a huge research gap. Maybe it's not a topic of interest to many donors or etc. But actually there's a huge need to do something in that field. And if done, with minimal efforts, it could have implications to global populations, to millions. So yes, personal experience play a major role. It's just having the right mentorship, the right opportunities at the right time, all of those play a major role.
I just wanted to say, in terms of memory loss, all the clients that I worked with that experienced trauma, they all suffer severe memory loss. So it definitely is a contributor, the abuse and the trauma definitely affects memory, yes.